The baby was just 10 months old at the time of the tragedy. Her mother, Dina Schlosser, seemed caring and loving, but what she did to her baby was truly horrifying. The police called it one of the most horrific scenes they had ever seen. Detective Brian Woods said he'd never faced anything like this in his entire career, and the mother claimed God had told her to do it. What could twist a mother's love into something so dark? She was born in 1969 as Dina Leitner, a quiet, sensitive girl raised in upstate New York. At just 8 years old, Dina was diagnosed with hydrocephalus, a condition in which fluid builds up in the brain, causing increased pressure in the skull. Between the ages of 8 and 13, she underwent a staggering 8 surgeries. Shunts were implanted in her brain, her heart, and her abdomen, one after another, just to keep her alive. Without treatment, hydrocephalus can damage brain function and result in permanent disability or death. The procedures left her with a shaved head and visible scars. At school, other children bullied her relentlessly, and although the operations helped preserve her cognitive functions, those early years shaped her deeply. According to her stepfather, Dina grew up emotionally dependent on her mother, a bond that would stay intense throughout her adult life. Despite the trauma, she was bright and determined. She graduated from Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York, with a bachelor's degree in psychology. That's where she met John Schlosser, who was also a student at Marist. But even from the beginning, their relationship had troubling dynamics. Unlike Dina, John didn't finish his degree and reportedly used Dina's family's tuition money for himself. The two eventually married and moved to Texas in hopes of building a life together. They settled in Fort Worth, Texas, where John built a successful career in the emerging computer science industry. At 32, Dina seemed to have an enviable life. John, an online computer specialist, was earning $100,000 a year, which allowed them to live in a spacious 3,000-square-foot home in an upscale neighborhood. His strong income meant Dina could be a stay-at-home mother to their 2 daughters, then ages 5 and 2, a role she truly cherished. She was happy to give up her own career and take care of the children full-time. In 2001, John lost his job. He began working as a software consultant after being unemployed for some time. Eventually, the bank foreclosed on their home. The family downsized, moving into a small apartment in the nearby city of Plano. Still, they tried to adapt and enjoyed a normal life. Dina worked at Children's World Learning Center. She was often seen pushing a stroller through the neighborhood, smiling or walking with her girls in the afternoons. But inside the walls of their modest apartment, something was shifting. The couple needed emotional support in their new situation, and they found guidance and a sense of belonging in their new church, Water of Life Ministries, led by a charismatic preacher named Doyle Davidson, a former veterinarian turned self-proclaimed prophet. Davidson said God told him to start Water of Life Ministries in the early 1980s. He claimed that God spoke to him in visions. He preached that women were weaker and inherently rebellious and needed to submit to their husbands.
But Jezebel is a woman, and it's not a spirit. Got it? It's a woman. I've never met such a bunch of dumb people in my whole life. I wonder what planet you're from. Amen.
Dina's identity as a mother seemed to fuse with a rising devotion to the church. Her world grew smaller. Her independence faded. Her spiritual beliefs grew more literal, more apocalyptic. The family attended church every day. Their children skipped meals because they were listening to the sermons. Dina stopped using antibiotics and began relying on prayer alone to heal. When her mother visited from Canada, she immediately noticed something was off with her daughter. Dina's behavior had become unusual. When one of the girls developed a cough, the grandmother wanted to give her some cough syrup, but Dina refused. She said medicines were evil, and that prayer was the only solution. Dina was convinced that Davidson could cure her mother of Parkinson's with prayer. She asked Davidson to place his hands on her mother in an attempt to drive out evil spirits and disease. Dina was so confident that her mother was cured that she threw out her medications.
Bad witchcraft. Bad. Bad witchcraft. Bad witchcraft. bad, bad, bad witchcraft, bad, bad witchcraft, bad, bad witchcraft, bad, bad witchcraft.
In 2003, Dina, who had suffered several miscarriages, gave birth to her third child, a baby girl named Maggie. Following their strict religious beliefs, the Schlossers avoided medical assistance. To them, medicine and science were evil. They refused to go to the hospital, even when the midwife urged them to. After a difficult labor, Maggie was born healthy. But something triggered a severe mental break in Dina. She believed that every answer she needed was in the Bible. 24 hours after Maggie was born, Dina was reading the Bible, and the word cut jumped up from the page. Acting on this delusion, Dina took a knife. When John came home, he found her holding the baby. Her wrists were injured. She was taken to the emergency room and was later diagnosed with bipolar disorder and postpartum depression with psychotic features. But the worst was yet to come. One day, Dina became convinced that the television was laughing at her. Terrified, she ran out of the house, leaving her 6-day-old daughter alone in the apartment. She was seen running down the street yelling a spirit was in her apartment, while her 5-year-old daughter was chasing after her on a bicycle. She was eventually found standing in an intersection, her hands raised toward the sky. When a police officer approached, she started screaming at the top of her lungs. Dina was admitted to a mental health facility, where she was diagnosed with severe postpartum psychosis. She also had a condition known as religious ideation. She believed God was speaking directly to her, experiencing delusions and hearing voices. In such a state, an individual can become extremely dangerous. Doctors wanted her to remain in the hospital for treatment, but Dina insisted on leaving. Child Protective Services launched an investigation over allegations of child neglect. Dina was deemed unfit to be left alone with her children. John Schlosser showed little emotion at the time. He repeatedly told the caseworker that the situation was in God's hands and everything would work out. He wanted Dina to come home too. He said he felt the best place for her was at home, and that Dina's spiritual vocabulary may be mixed up, and she might be perceived as being crazy. He suggested that their church be contacted about any aberrant beliefs, because he didn't want their religious beliefs to be confused with psychosis. While Dina was released, welfare officers scheduled visits to monitor her every single day. She agreed to see a psychiatrist and receive counseling. Neighbors said Dina was a loving, attentive mother. The children remained in the home under strict conditions. Dina's sister-in-law lived with them to provide full-time supervision. With treatment and proper oversight, Dina improved for a time. She began to seem like her old self again and reported no hallucinations. In August, Texas CPS deemed that Dina was fully recovered. The 7-month case was closed. But what changed? And was Dina truly better or just quiet? Jeff Wool, spokesman for the Family and Protective Services Department, said, "At the time we closed the case, we had been assured that Mom was stabilized and that she was not a risk to herself or her children. However, their pastor, Doyle Davidson, believed mental illness was the result of demonic possession. This belief led Dina's husband to stop buying her medication regularly, and eventually, she stopped taking it altogether. Her mental state continued to fray. Her thoughts were growing darker. Somewhere along the way, Dina became convinced that her infant daughter Margaret was destined to marry their pastor, Doyle Davidson. Behind closed doors, this once studious psychology major was losing her grip, not just on herself, but on reality. But no one seemed to be watching closely enough to see just how far she was slipping. The day before the brutal act, the couple got into an argument in the church parking lot. They were discussing a Bible passage about a woman who promises her baby to God, and Dina said she wanted to give their youngest daughter, Margaret, to God. She also told her husband she believed Margaret was meant for Davidson, who was 72 at the time. It was more than delusion. It was devotion, twisting itself into obsession. John Schlosser said his wife was very religious but often misinterpreted scriptures. When they returned home, John spanked his wife with a wooden spoon in front of the children for not listening to him during the parking lot argument. No one called a doctor. Instead, Dina stayed home with Margaret. But she wasn't preparing for a murder. She was preparing for a sacrifice. It was Monday morning, November 22nd, 2004. Dina's two older daughters, aged 6 and 9, had already left for school. Her husband John was at work. In their Plano apartment, Dina Schlosser was alone with her 10-month-old daughter, Margaret. Inside Dina's mind, the lines between scripture and delusion were blurring fast. She had become consumed by signs and symbols. The television was on. At some point that morning, a news story aired about a young boy being mauled by a lion at the San Francisco Zoo. For Dina, this wasn't just another tragedy. It was a divine omen, a message. In her mind, the news confirmed what she'd feared, or believed, all along. The apocalypse had begun, and she was living in the final days. God was calling her to act, to sacrifice, to obey. By this point, she was speaking openly about hearing divine voices. Dina heard God telling her to remove Margaret's arms, and then her own. This wasn't just religious fervor. It was psychosis, tightly woven into the language of faith, the kind that doesn't shout. It quietly rationalizes. And to a woman desperate for clarity, purpose, and salvation, it made sense. She walked into the kitchen and reached for the largest knife from the set, a 9-inch blade. Then, with her mind consumed by a belief that it was time for Margaret to return to God and that God wanted her, she approached the crib. Investigators later determined that Dina made over 50 motions with the knife to carry out the act. Then she turned the knife on herself, causing an injury to her shoulder. When it was over, she called her husband and told him what she had done. John couldn't believe her. He called a local daycare center and asked the staff to check on his wife while he drove home from work. The concerned daycare workers called 911. The police were dispatched immediately. When they arrived, there were no signs of panic. Dina was sitting quietly on the floor and singing Christian hymns. She was still holding the kitchen knife in her hand. A police officer walked to the bedroom and looked inside the crib. What he saw was beyond disturbing. The baby was lying still, with her both arms removed. The police said the child's injuries were horrifying. Detective Brian Wood said, "I've never had to face anything like this before, and frankly, I'd never want to." Dina admitted to causing the injuries, but refused to elaborate. Little Maggie was rushed to the nearby hospital, but her condition was too severe. She died shortly after arriving. Maggie never reached her first birthday. Neighbors described Dina Schlosser as a devoted and attentive mother. They said she regularly took her children swimming during the summer, held picnics in the courtyard, and could often be seen walking her baby around the apartment complex at the same time each afternoon. One resident, 43-year-old Dina Livingston, recalled seeing her pushing the stroller on Sunday, just the day before the tragedy. 2 days earlier, she had spotted Dina waiting with the baby outside the elementary school where her two older daughters were enrolled. Livingston said she didn't give off like she was in a distant world or didn't care about the baby. Her husband added, "To see her with the girls, you would just think she was a great mother." Police officer Carl Duke said, "Schlosser was not talking when she left here. She was very quiet, subdued. Hours after her arrest, she was repeatedly chanting, 'Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Lord.'" And as the officers questioned Dina, her words were as unsettling as the scene itself. She claimed that God had told her to do it. During the interrogation, she never broke down. She said she had been praying. She'd waited for a sign, and she believed she had received one. Inside that quiet apartment, surrounded by toys, diapers, and folded laundry, Dina had done something that no one could understand, but the legal system would soon have to try. 35-year-old Dina was charged with capital murder. If convicted, she could face life in prison or the death penalty. The question was never whether she had done it. The evidence was overwhelming. Dina saw no need to hide the truth, because she was convinced she was following God's will. In her mind, it was a divine mission. The defense didn't deny the crime. Instead, they argued that Dina was not guilty by reason of insanity. The first witness was 911 operator Steve Edwards, who took Schlosser's call. In the recording, Edwards asked if there was an emergency, and she responded, "Yes." When he asked exactly what happened, Schlosser calmly described her actions. The gospel song "He Touched Me" played in the background. As the 911 recording played in court, Dina sat slumped in her chair and pressed her chin into her chest. staring down at her hands. At the heart of the trial was the issue of postpartum psychosis. Defense attorney William Schultz said, "This is somebody who at the time was not capable of knowing what she was doing was wrong. She didn't see it coming. Normally, Dina is a sweet woman. She cares. She has compassion." Prosecutor Curtis Howard disagreed, saying that Schlosser did know right from wrong when she killed her daughter. She knew what she was doing and should be sent to prison for life. Prosecutors questioned how someone so impaired could remain so composed and so intentional. Howard said the fact Schlosser told her husband that she had killed the baby proved she knew what she was doing. But the defense argued that Dina's behavior wasn't proof of sanity. It was evidence of deep delusion, masked by a religious framework so powerful that it gave structure to her madness. Psychiatric experts maintained that Dina wasn't faking. The hallucinations, the divine voices, the belief in prophecy, they were all real to her. Doctors testified about Dina's erratic behavior and hallucinations, including apostles rising out of red-tinted streets to herald the apocalypse. She had not acted out of hatred. She had acted under a religious delusion. Psychiatrist Dr. David Self, who evaluated Schlosser after her arrest, testified that Dina had experienced command hallucinations, hearing the voice of God telling her what to do. He told the court she believed the world was ending and that her child was to be sacrificed to save her. Her attack was a religious frenzy, triggered by her interpretation of a disturbing news story, leading to a psychotic break. He said Schlosser told him she also wanted to give her arms and head to God, but after her shoulder injury, she couldn't go on because the pain was too strong. John Schlosser testified that Dina's behavior was disturbing after Maggie's birth. He said she told him, "I want to give the baby to Doyle. I want to give the baby to God." The defense pointed fingers at John Schlosser, arguing he failed to get his wife the mental health treatment she so clearly needed. He should have acted sooner, both to help his wife and to protect their daughters. Instead, he relied on conversations with their minister and followed church teachings which discouraged psychological treatment. Psychologist Jonna Long evaluated John to determine whether his two daughters could safely remain in his care. She noted that the couple's 6-year-old daughter told CPS caseworkers that her father had spanked her mother with a wooden spoon, a detail Long interpreted as a sign of his limited understanding of mental illness, which could have negatively affected both his wife and children. Although he scored within normal limits on a parenting test, he could benefit from parenting education. She said he showed a disturbing lack of emotion after his baby's death. In her report, she wrote, "This absence of grief is either an immature denial of normal human emotions that hover under the surface of his controlled veneer, or indicates a true lack of emotion." John told her he felt a little melancholy about the baby's death, but found comfort that she was praising God in heaven. He added, "I was almost done being very sad when I buried her." Howard Shapiro, John Schlosser's attorney, disputed Long's analysis. He said, "If you think that John Schlosser hasn't grieved, you'd be wrong. Maybe he hasn't cried openly on TV. Maybe he hasn't jumped up and down and ripped his clothes off, but he's grieved." The prosecution claimed the defense was simply trying to shift the blame away from Dina herself. Dina's stepfather, Mick McCauley, a mental health counselor who lives with Schlosser's mother Connie in Canada, acknowledged that her actions were driven primarily by mental illness. But he also believed that the religious teachings of Doyle Davidson had contributed to her mental collapse. He said, "I don't think there's any question that what we saw happen here is postpartum psychosis, but that doesn't mean there aren't dynamics in force to push the person toward the psychotic break." He explained that Davidson often used intense and harsh language in his sermons. While he made it clear that no one had directly encouraged violence, McCauley said, "This diminishing of women, this diminishing of women's powers, women's importance, referring to women as Jezebels, further undermines an already fragile ego state that Dina's experiencing." According to McCauley, Dina would talk about Pastor Davidson incessantly during her near-daily phone calls with her mother. She urged her parents to listen to his online sermons, and they did, for more than 60 hours. But the more they listened, the more concerned they became.
This is my building, and I don't have people tell me what to do. Some think they can, but eventually they found out they better listen, because I have the authority of Jesus. there's some right here that need to go sit down. Come on, let's go.
Doyle, we do not see them.
Kathy, you can leave the room if you don't like the way I'm running this place.
Dina's husband also supported the minister. His personal website featured Bible passages and a direct link to Davidson's ministry. Macaulay said that as he and his wife struggle to understand their daughter's unthinkable crime, Davidson is ever present on their minds. He said, "Connie looked at me somewhat plaintively after she had a good cry the other day and said, 'I hope Dina won't go back to that church.'" Before Doyle Davidson entered Missouri's School of Veterinary Medicine in 1958, he was rotating the tires on his car, and he heard God say, "I don't want you to be a veterinarian. I want you to be a minister of the gospel." He didn't listen to God and became an equine veterinarian. According to Davidson, for 2 years, an angel rode in his car asking when he was going to preach the gospel. In 1969, God told him to sell his hospital and practice and obey him. In 1980, God instructed him to speak to the people in Plano, Texas, where he founded Water of Life Ministries. Davidson referred to himself as an apostle of Jesus Christ. In 1987, Doyle Davidson claimed that God had told him another man's wife, Lisa Staton, was no longer married to her husband, but to him. At the time, Davidson was still legally married. Lisa and her husband were deeply disturbed by the claim and eventually went into hiding. But the minister continued to write Lisa personal, suggestive emails which he published online. On one occasion, Davidson showed up at their home uninvited and entered Lisa's room. Her husband heard her shouting, ran upstairs, and found Davidson on top of her, claiming he was trying to cast out a Jezebel spirit. Police were called, and they reported smelling alcohol on Davidson's breath. Though no charges were filed, he was issued a restraining order and fined for public intoxication. Lisa's refusal to submit became a recurring theme in Davidson's sermons for years to come.
He gave me a wife, and her name is Lisa, and Lisa's a my wife that God gave me. And you want to know who told me she was a God told me she was a
Davidson said the allegations were absurd. He said, "I'm an apostle, and I'm a prophet. I only teach what's in the Bible, and that's what makes them mad." Davidson acknowledged that his teachings are unconventional. He admitted he isn't well liked by the broader religious community, and that he was removed from the Daystar television network, a major Christian broadcaster, after his sermons offended top officials. As for Dina, Davidson claimed he had little interaction with her. John Schlosser said that when Dina told him she wanted to give their newborn baby to God and to Davidson, the couple consulted their minister, who told Dina she was misinterpreting the Bible. John said he thought the problem was solved. However, Davidson said he never talked with them about Dina's interpretation of the Bible. Under oath, Davidson testified that, in his view, all mental illness was demonic in nature. For that reason, he noted, some of his devoted followers avoided medication. He said on the stand, "I do not believe that any mental illness exists other than demons, and no medication can straighten it out, other than the power of God." The central question of the case was whether Dina Schlosser's mental state had been so severely impaired that she couldn't understand her actions were wrong, the legal standard for insanity in Texas. A new development emerged late in the trial. Doctors had discovered that Schlosser had a brain tumor. A neurologist confirmed the diagnosis, and her attorneys argued that the tumor may have contributed to her hallucinations. After 42 hours of deliberation, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict, with 10 out of 12 jurors concluding that Schlosser was legally insane. As a result, Judge Chris Oldner declared a mistrial. Both the prosecution and defense agreed to let Judge Oldner decide the case himself, using the evidence already presented during the February trial. In February 2006, over a year after Margaret's death, the judge delivered the verdict. Dina Schlosser was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The court ruled that she was legally insane at the time of the crime. She didn't go to prison. Instead, she was committed to a state psychiatric hospital. At the heart of the decision was not a question of punishment, but one of responsibility. Dina had suffered from untreated postpartum psychosis, and the system, from the healthcare providers and CPS to her own husband, had failed to intervene in time. Prosecutor Curtis Howard said after the verdict, This is a case that could have gone both ways. We knew that. 38-year-old Schlosser remained silent as bailiffs escorted her out of the courtroom. She briefly looked toward her former stepfather but didn't say anything. Defense attorney David Haynes said, "We have a just verdict in a just case, but yes, it is bittersweet. She wanted to be sent to the state hospital. She feels it is her best chance to get better. My own expectation is that she will remain at the hospital for many, many years." Dina was sent away for treatment, but for the public, there was one question. If she wasn't guilty, would she one day be free? Texas Child Protective Services came under intense scrutiny after a number of high-profile child abuse deaths, including the Schlosser case. CPS initially sought to terminate the parental rights of both parents, arguing that John Schlosser had failed to protect Margaret. John underwent a psychological evaluation, which described him as having narcissistic personality traits and noted his lack of action in safeguarding his children. CPS outlined strict conditions for him to regain custody. He was required to complete psychotherapy, attend parenting classes, and have his sister move in to help supervise the household. He met these requirements and was ultimately granted full custody of his daughters, raising them as a single father. He later filed for divorce, and as part of the settlement, Dina Schlosser was legally barred from ever having contact with him or their children again. A lot of former members of Water of Life Church said it was a cult. After the trial, public backlash led to Davidson's television ministry being removed from broadcasts outside the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Dina Schlosser remained at the North Texas State Hospital in Vernon. There, she was a roommate of Andrea Yates, the Texas mother who had drowned her 5 children in a bathtub. Yates explained that she wanted to protect them from evil. She also said she felt compelled to act by voices, but unlike Dina, she believed those voices were coming from a dark force. The two women became great friends. Dina said about Yates, "She is almost my identical personality. I think we'll be friends forever. I've only known her for a short period of time, but I believe the feeling is mutual. She probably thinks that same thing." But then in 2008, just 2 years after being committed, something unexpected happened. Dina was released. She was deemed no longer to be a threat to herself or others, and declared mentally stable enough to leave the hospital under strict supervision. She was ordered to see a psychiatrist once a week, take medication, be on physician-approved birth control, and have no unsupervised contact with children. She was placed in an outpatient program in Rusk, Texas, and her discharge was not made public at first, but it didn't stay quiet for long. When the news broke, public outrage was immediate. To many, it felt impossible to understand. A mother who had ended her daughter's life in such a disturbing way was now walking free, even if under watch. Some people were furious, others were terrified. In April 2010, Dina was recommitted to an inpatient facility after firefighters saw her wandering the streets at 2 a.m. in Richardson, dazed and confused. And then it got stranger. By 2012, Dina was back in the news. This time, because of her job. Reporters discovered that she had been working at a Walmart in Terrell, Texas, just outside of Dallas, under her maiden name, Dina Leitner. She was employed as a cashier in the children's clothing section. The backlash was instant. The idea of Dina now handling baby onesies and toddler socks left people stunned. Walmart claimed they hadn't known her full history when they hired her. Once they did, Dina was immediately fired. But even that wasn't enough to quiet the storm. People questioned how someone like Dina could be released at all, and how someone found not guilty by reason of insanity could re-enter society so soon. Although psychiatrists declared that Schlosser didn't pose a risk, area residents were concerned. One resident said, "It's a shame for her to be in the hospital for such a short time, and then have the freedom that you and I enjoy after what she did." However, another person spoke about the lack of compassion. "I think it's unchristian to deprive her of her livelihood and a chance to continue her life. Just having the knowledge of what she did to her child will stay with her for the rest of her life." Former Dallas County Prosecutor Toby Shook, who was not involved in the Schlosser case, said that because Schlosser has no felony conviction, she has the same rights as everyone else. You naturally want that person brought to justice or locked up for the rest of their life, but that person is suffering from a mental disease. They weren't acting in their right mind. Texas officials stated that the goal for patients in mental care facilities is for them to get better, so as they progress, they are given opportunities to reintegrate with society. Eventually, Dina was ordered to remain committed to a state hospital. Judge Andrea Thompson confirmed that Dina continues to have religious delusions when she's not on medication, and that it's better for everyone if she remains in round-the-clock care. What happened inside that quiet apartment wasn't sudden. It was a tragedy that had been unfolding in plain sight, one warning sign at a time. And maybe the most chilling part is this: it could happen again. Was Dina evil or insane? And was it the right decision to release her from the hospital after the murder? Let me know what you think in the comments. Subscribe to my channel to see more chilling cases. Until next time.